The year was 1944. The air war over Europe had reached a terrible, grinding crescendo. By day, the thunderous formations of American flying fortresses and liberators bore the brunt of the Luftwaffe's fury. By night, the RAF's Lancasters and Halifaxes painted German cities in fire and ash. Yet in the shadow of these colossal, publicly celebrated campaigns, a quieter, more clandestine war was being waged, a war of whispers, of electronic shadows, and of secrets so potent they could alter the very physics of the conflict. It was in this realm of shadows that Allied Command, a joint Anglo-American intelligence cell operating out of a bomb-hardened basement in Whitehall, greenlit a mission so sensitive it existed outside the standard chain of command. Codenamed Operation Cloakroom, its objective was a midnight reconnaissance flight over occupied Norway, specifically the mist-shrouded fjord-ribbled coast near Trondheim. German naval intelligence, decrypted fragments from Ultra suggested, was testing a new form of long-range U-boat coordination signal there, a signal said to be immune to Allied jamming. The Allies needed to get a look, to capture its signature with a suite of experimental listening equipment. But to send a standard reconnaissance aircraft was to invite its swift destruction. They needed a ghost. The B-24 nod was a deliberate piece of misdirection, hinting at the American Liberator airframe. In truth, it was a Frankensteinian masterpiece of espionage engineering. Its bones were that of a crippled Lancaster salvaged from a crash in Kent. Its wings, however, were elongated, elegantly swept back affairs, skinned not in standard doped fabric or aluminum, but in a revolutionary radar-absorbent material derived from a captured German research paper, a stiff, felt-like composite that drank radio waves. Its four Merlin engines were fitted with oversized, shrouded propellers designed for near-silent running at certain RPMs, and exhaust dampeners that glowed a dull, heatless cherry red instead of the usual fiery blast. Most crucially, its entire bomb bay had been transformed into a laboratory, a pressurized compartment housing the ANS-47 listener array, a bank of valve-driven receivers and primitive tape recorders that could tune into frequencies most scientists didn't believe could be used for communication. The Fordham was a prototype variant that officially didn't exist. It had been assembled not in a Bristol factory, but in a disguised dirigible hangar in the Scottish Highlands by a team of engineers and physicists who had been seconded from their universities and laboratories, never to return to their old lives until the war was won or lost. It carried no national markings, only a matte charcoal black paint that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Its official designation, B-24/triangle, used the mathematical symbol for change or difference, an insider's joke for those who knew just how different it truly was. On the night of November 17, 1944, under a sky scraped clean of cloud by a bitter North Sea wind, the Fordham, call sign Fordham 21, lifted off from RAF Kinloss at 23:47 hours. Its 7 crew were not typical bomber boys. They were volunteers from the RAF's 192nd Squadron, a unit officially tasked with radio countermeasures, but which in reality served as a pool for the most technically gifted and discreet airmen in the service. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Alastair Crowe, was a veteran of 33 night missions over Berlin, known for a preternatural calmness. His navigator, Flying Officer Reginald Professor Finch, held a doctorate in physics from Cambridge. The 5 others were specialists in signals, engineering, and though it was never spoken, quiet desperation. The flight north was conducted in near total radio silence, at an altitude that kept it beneath the fray of the mainstream air war. The crew's world was the soft green glow of their instrument panels, the mudded rumble of the muffled Merlins, and the eerie quiet of their own sound-dampened cabin. They crossed the Norwegian coast at 01:22 hours, slipping into the labyrinth of fjords like a black knife into water. For 47 minutes, they orbited the target grid, a lonely stretch of water near the island of Hitra. The ANS-47 array whirred and clicked, its reels spinning, its needles dancing across graph paper. Finch, hunched over his scope in the converted bomb bay, watched patterns emerge that made no sense, pulses of energy that seemed to phase in and out of known frequency bands, carrying a modulation that was neither Morse nor any teleprinter code he knew. Then at 0211 hours, the primary receiver locked onto the strongest signal yet. It was not coming from the surface or from any German installation on the coast. The triangulation indicator pointed straight up into the empty, frozen vault of the Arctic sky. Vinch keyed the intercom to the cockpit, his voice tight with academic disbelief. "Captain, source is aerial, extremely high altitude, possibly stratospheric. The waveform it's coherent, but the carrier frequency is shifting. It's not a spark gap transmission, it's continuous." Before Crow could respond, the radio operator, Sergeant David Clark, monitoring the designated emergency VHF channel, let out a sharp gasp. His headset was filled with a wash of static from which a voice, faint and distorted as if heard through water, was repeating a phrase in English. But it was an English that was flat, oddly cadenced, devoid of accent or emotion. Clark strained to listen, then switched his transmitter to the crew frequency. "Skip, I'm picking up a broadcast on the guard channel. It's giving coordinates, grid references, but they're not for any map I have, and it's identifying friendlies, call signs from the 8th Air Force, missions that aren't scheduled for another week." A cold dread, colder than the air outside their thin skin of plywood and composite, seeped into the Fordham's cabin. This was the nightmare scenario. Not enemy action, but an intelligence anomaly so profound it threatened to dismantle their understanding of the battle itself. Crow made his decision. The mission was aborted. They had the signal on tape. Their duty now was to get that tape back to Whitehall. "Right. Clark, log the transmission, but do not respond. Professor, secure your reels. We're going home." As Crow banked the black bomber west, pushing the throttles forward to begin the long climb out of the fjords, Clark's console erupted again. This time, the signal was overwhelming, crashing over the guard channel with a power that made his equipment shriek with feedback. The same flat, aquatic voice cut through, but now it was directly addressing them. "Fordham 2-1. Fordham 2-1. Adjust heading to 270 true. Descend to Angels 1-5. You are off course. You are off course." Every man on the crew heard it. It was in their headphones. It was in the intercom. It seemed to be in the air itself. Crow's eyes locked with those of his co-pilot. They were on heading 285. They were at 18,000 feet. The voice was wrong, but it was commanding. "Do not acknowledge," Crow hissed. "It's a German trick, a new direction-finding ploy. Maintain course." But the voice returned, sharper now, losing its artificial evenness, tinged with something that sounded like urgency or frustration. "Fordham 2-1. You must comply. You are entering a non-temporal corridor. Adjust heading now." Then Clark's voice, young and frayed, broke over the intercom. He was transmitting, breaking radio silence. He couldn't help it. The words were torn from him, a final, desperate report to a world that was already receding from them. "Fordham 2-1, to any station. We've acquired the signal. It's not German. I say again, the signal source is not German." The transmission ceased not with a scream, not with static, but with a perfect, absolute void. At RAF Kinloss, the radio operator on duty heard Clark's last words with crystalline clarity, his hand frozen over the logbook. At the chain home radar station at Netherbutton, the friendly blip that was Fordham 2-1 didn't fade. It didn't explode into the scattered cloud of a catastrophic hit. In one sweep, it was there, a green bead of light crawling across the darkened scope. The next sweep, it was gone, as if it had never been.
For 50 years, the Fortem mission existed in the half-life of rumor. It was a tale whispered in the oak-paneled bars of London clubs frequented by retired RAF officers, dismissed with a shake of the head and a long sip of whiskey. It was referenced in cryptic footnotes in obscure aviation journals, attributed to mythical late-war special projects. It was a favorite hangar story among modern RAF technicians, a piece of folklore used to spook new recruits on night watch. The consensus, among the few who had ever heard the whispers, was that it had been a tragic, if classified, accident, a one-off experimental aircraft lost to mechanical failure, or a lucky German night fighter over the North Sea. The details were just the embellishments of time and tragedy. This settled history began to crack in the spring of 1994. The Cold War was over. The Iron Curtain was rusted scrap. In a spirit of cautious transparency, the British government initiated a slow, partial declassification of certain WW2-era documents. The process was glacial, overseen by wary mandarins, and the files released were often the least consequential. It was amidst this bureaucratic drip feed that Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a dogged, freelance historian specializing in electronic warfare, found herself in the reading room of the UK National Archives at Kew. Shaw was chasing a dead end, a reference to a Project Gorgon she'd found in the diary of a deceased BOAC pilot who'd done wartime ferry work. The trail had gone cold. Frustrated, she ordered up a seemingly unrelated box of files from the Air Ministry, catalogued vaguely as Post-War Liaison, Anglo-U.S. Signals Research 1945-48. The box was a mess, a clear example of the rushed post-war consolidation of records. Among dry memos about valve specifications and minutes from joint committee meetings, her fingers brushed against a folder that felt different. It was heavier, its cardstock thicker and of a higher quality. It was misfiled, utterly out of place. There was no official accession stamp, no catalog number penned on its tab. It was sealed with a strip of brittle yellowing adhesive tape, and across its front, in a neat, precise hand that was neither typewritten nor standard clerical script, were written 3 words. Shaw's breath caught. Air was clear, Air Ministry. Shadow was a known designation for the most secret, deniable projects, the ones even the Prime Minister might not be fully briefed on. But temporal, that was not a classification. It was not a security level like top secret or most secret. It was a descriptor. It meant that, of or relating to time, it made no sense. A prank, perhaps, a piece of deliberate misdirection. Heart hammering against her ribs, aware of the silent, watchful presence of the archive clerks, she carefully peeled back the ancient tape. It cracked like ice. Inside, the folder contained only 3 items, resting on the bare manila as if they were holy relics. The first was a photograph, black and white, glossy, but blurred as if taken from a great distance or through a turbulent atmosphere. It showed an aircraft in flight, a 4-engine heavy, silhouetted against a dull sky. But its lines were wrong. The wings were too swept, the fuselage too sleek, its surface devoid of any markings or even the usual panel lines. It looked less like a photograph of a solid object, and more like a smudge of darker gray against a lighter gray, a shadow given form. It was captioned in the same neat hand, B24/Delta, 17 November 44, approximate 0215 hours, position unconfirmed. The second was a radio transcript. It was a single sheet of teleprinter paper, the old brittle kind that faded to brown. The text was eerily distorted, the letters misaligned, as if the machine that printed it had been suffering a seizure. But the words were decipherable. Fortem-21, unintelligible. Acquiring source. Altitude reading is impossible. Unknown voice. Fortem-21. Adjust heading to 270 true. Descend to Angels 15. Fortem-21. Do not acknowledge. Maintain course. Unknown voice. You are entering a non-temporal corridor. Adjust heading now. Fortem-21. Voice identified as Sergeant Clark. Fortem-21 to any station. We've acquired the signal. It's not German. I say again, the signal source is not German. Transmission ceases. At the bottom of the transcript was a handwritten note. VHF guard channel. Signal strength unprecedented. Source triangulation. Convergent error. Impossible. Voice analysis. Non-human inflection patterns. Concluded, not German deception. Nature, undefined. The third item was a report, a single page typed on the distinctive, heavy bond paper of the War Cabinet. It was dated 18th of November 1944, the day after the flight. Its subject line was, Operation Cloakroom, Terminal Event. It was a dry clinical summary of the loss of aircraft B-24/Delta and its crew. It cited presumed enemy action and recommended the immediate termination of the Fortem project and the destruction of all associated materials. It was stamped in large red block letters that seemed to shout from the page, "Destroy after reading." Beneath this stamp, in the same neat, meticulous hand as on the folder, was a single cursive addendum, 2 words that changed everything, that turned a historical mystery into a chilling ongoing enigma, 2 words that explained why the report was here, in her hands, and not ashes in a Whitehall furnace 50 years prior, someone had forgotten to. And below that, a final chilling line, written so lightly as if it was a ghost on the paper itself. The corridor remains, the signal persists. Who was warning whom?
The aftermath of Operation Quiet Seek was not a public inquiry. It was a silent, surgical excision. The personnel involved, from the radar operators at Netherbutton who watched the blip vanish, to the radio officer at Kinloss who heard Clark's final truncated words, to the crews of the search aircraft who witnessed the warm, metallic sea, were not debriefed in the standard sense. They were contained. One by one, they were summoned to secure offices in London, often in the labyrinthine basement of the Air Ministry, or to a nondescript country house in Surrey. The process was not conducted by their superior officers, but by quiet, sharp-eyed civilians from MI5's Directorate of Counter-Espionage and liaisons from the American OSS. The sessions were called post-operational stress evaluations, a euphemism for a process designed to do two things: extract every sensory detail of the event, and then seal that detail behind a wall of legal threat and national shame. Each man was presented with a document under the Official Secrets Act, but it was a unique, bespoke version. It did not simply swear them to secrecy for the duration of the war. It bound them for life, in perpetuity, under penalties that were not specified, but were described in chillingly vague terms. Grave consequences for the security of the realm. They were told in no uncertain terms that the mission of Fordham 2-1 had never happened. Any discussion of it, even with their own crewmates, even with their spouses on their deathbeds, constituted treason. Their service records were subtly altered. Logbook entries for that night were replaced with generic notations for training or equipment testing. For most, the weight of this oath, coupled with the genuine, surreal trauma of what they had witnessed, was enough to seal their lips for decades. They carried the secret like a swallowed stone. But in 1968, one man's stone became too heavy to bear. Wing Commander Hugh Stanton, retired, had been the senior air traffic control officer at RAF Kinloss on the night of November 17, 1944. He was the man who had authorized Fordham 2-1's takeoff clearance, and he was the one who had first notified command of its loss. A decorated veteran of the Battle of Britain, known for his unflappable calm, had suffered a series of strokes in the late 1960s. As his health deteriorated, so did his psychological defenses. During a routine visit from an RAF historical liaison officer, a captain tasked with collecting anecdotal material for regimental histories, Stanton, in the sunroom of his cottage in the Cotswolds, mistook the young officer for one of the quiet men from the ministry. The dam broke. His family, listening from the kitchen, heard his voice, frail but sharp with remembered terror, rise in pitch. They made us sign, you know. Made us sign our own silence. But I heard the boy. I heard Clark's voice. He wasn't afraid. He was astonished. The liaison officer, confused but perceptive, turned on a concealed tape recorder he carried for interviews. Stanton's voice dropped to a whisper, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the garden wall. The plane didn't crash. I've heard crashes on the radio, the screaming static, the breakup noises. This was clean, a knife cut. One moment a voice describing a light, the next a silence so absolute it was louder than any explosion. He began to weep, slow, tired tears. Something took it, right out of the sky, and we recorded it. Every word, every scream of the instruments. We had it all on tape, and they took that too. They took it all and they put it in a hole and buried it deeper than that damned plane. The interview was terminated by a flustered family member. The shaken liaison officer turned his tape and notes over to his superior. Within 24 hours, 2 officials from the Ministry of Defense arrived at Stanton's home. They spoke with him privately. They collected the liaison officer's tape and notes. They reminded the family of the wing commander's lifetime obligations under the Official Secrets Act. The historical liaison officer was reassigned to a desk job in Gibraltar. Stanton's statement, a raw, unguarded confession from a dying war hero, was not filed away.
It was sealed inside a double-locked security container with the highest possible classification. It would not see the light of day for another 3 decades. It was the human proof that the official story was a lie, and the authorities intended for that proof to molder in the dark forever. The Allied cover-up was so effective it created a historical vacuum. But on the other side of the conflict, in the ruins of the Third Reich, lay fragments of a parallel mystery. In the 1990s, with the reunification of Germany, vast archives of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe, previously held in East German vaults or captured by the Soviets, became accessible to researchers. Among mountains of mundane reports on fuel shortages and troop dispositions, a handful of documents stood out like shards of dark glass. They concerned the Norwegian Coastal Defense Network. German radar stations at Lista, Stavanger, and Trondheim had been among the most advanced in the world. Their logs, meticulously kept, noted repeated interruptions and disturbances throughout 1944, blamed for atmospherics or Allied jamming experiments. But a deeper dive revealed specific, recurring entries. A report from the Luftnachrichten Regiment 353 stationed at Trondheim dated November 18, 1944, the morning after Fortum 21's disappearance, detailed an event from the previous night. At 02:10 hours, their Wurzburg-Riesa giant radar, a dish 7 meters across, had detected a primary contact of unusual character. It was not the fuzzy, elongated return of a bomber formation. It was small, intensely focused, and stationary at high altitude. Then, at 02:13 hours, the operators reported that the return divided on their screen. A secondary, fainter return, consistent with a large aircraft, appeared close to the first. Moments later, the primary return began to move vertically at a speed the operator logged as unvorstellbar, unimaginable. It ascended off their scope in less than 10 seconds. The secondary return simply vanished. The operator's handwritten annotation in the margin read, Metallisches Objekt, senkrecht, unmögliche Geschwindigkeit, metallic object, vertical, impossible speed. Even more revealing were the notes of a scientist attached to the German Forschungsanstalt, Research Institute for Radiophysics, who had been dispatched to investigate the radar anomalies. In a personal notebook, later found buried in a Berlin archive, he had scribbled a series of frantic, speculative lines. Next to a crude sketch of a vertical ascent trajectory, he wrote, Nicht Flugzeug, not aircraft, nicht Rakete, not rocket, and then 2 lines that carried the weight of a profound and frightening deduction. Nicht unseres, not ours, nicht deren, not theirs. This anonymous German scientist had arrived at the same terrifying conclusion as the Allied analyst would. The phenomenon was not a secret weapon of the Reich, nor was it a secret weapon of the Allies. It was an independent variable, a third party in the sky. The mystery seemed destined to remain a paper ghost, a conflict of contradictory documents and silenced testimony. Then, in the summer of 2011, technology pried open a new chapter. A Norwegian Marine survey team, operating the remotely operated vehicle, ROV Njord Explorer, was conducting a commercial seabed mapping operation in the Norwegian Sea, east of the Hitra Island. Their focus was geological, searching for potential deep-sea mineral nodules. At a depth of 702 meters, in the eternal crushing dark, the ROV's high-intensity lights illuminated a debris field. It was not the scattered, expansive wreckage of a ship. It was a compact, twisted nest of metal. The sonar image showed a main structure, approximately 30 meters long, with broken spars radiating from it. The team, thinking they had found a sunken wartime vessel, moved in for a visual inspection. The material was aluminum alloy, corroded but identifiable. The structural pieces, bulkhead frames, stringers, sections of corrugated skin, were unmistakably from a large aircraft of World War II vintage. They found a fragment of a landing gear assembly and a heavily degraded piece of machinery that could have been a Merlin engine block. It was, they concluded, likely the remains of an Allied bomber, perhaps a Halifax or a Liberator, lost on a raid or a transit flight. But as the ROV's manipulator claw gently turned over pieces and the cameras documented the site in minute detail, anomalies piled up. A senior marine archaeologist consulted on the video feed noted three deeply disturbing facts. First, there was no battle damage, no shrapnel holes, no cannon strike patterns, no evidence of fire from defensive guns or flak. The metal was torn and twisted, but not punctured. Second, and more strangely, there was no impact deformation. In a crash from high altitude into water, a surface that becomes like concrete at such speeds, the airframe should be utterly pancaked, compressed into a disk of mangled wreckage. This wreck was twisted, as if by a tremendous torsional force, but not flattened. It looked less like something that had hit the sea, and more like something that had been wrung out, like a wet towel, by a giant hand. Third, forensic analysis of the metal fragments later recovered showed no burn marks, no sooting, no heat discoloration from an in-flight fire or post-crash fuel explosion. The engines had not been running at the moment of destruction. The marine archaeologist's confidential report to the Norwegian government included a hesitant, almost reluctant conclusion. The wreckage deposition is inconsistent with a high-velocity aerial impact or mid-air breakup. The deformation patterns suggest an instantaneous, omnidirectional compressive event of colossal force, followed by a deposition on the seabed that avoided the high-energy trauma of a surface strike. In simpler, more chilling terms, it was almost as if the plane had been compressed by massive pressure, a pressure far greater and more uniform than the sea could provide, and then gently placed on the seabed, as if it had appeared there, fully crushed, materializing in the deep water, without the violent journey through the surface layers. The coordinates of the find were quietly passed to British and American authorities. Within weeks, the site was declared a war grave and placed off-limits to all further exploration. The official story was that it was the final resting place of an unidentified Allied aircraft, and its sanctity must be respected. But those who had seen the ROV footage knew the truth was far more complex and far more unsettling. The physical evidence on the ocean floor did not solve the mystery of Fordham 21. It deepened it, transforming it from a story of disappearance into a story of translocation, of an aircraft that may not have crashed at all, but was somehow and elsewhere unmade. The full, terrifying logic behind the 50-year silence was finally revealed not by a leaked document, but by a scheduled, routine declassification in 2012. Among a batch of mundane Air Ministry files from 1945 was a single, thin memo. It was the ultimate summary, the final word on Operation Cloakroom from the highest level of Allied scientific intelligence. It was addressed to the Chief of the Air Staff and copied to the Prime Minister's scientific advisor. Its subject, disposition of the Fordham 21 inquiry. It contained no speculation about German weapons, no mention of secret Soviet tests. It was stark, clinical, and breathtaking in its implications. The key paragraph read, "The combined analysis of radar, radio, and hydrographic data leads the Joint Assessment Panel to one inescapable conclusion. Fordham 21 did not encounter a hostile aircraft or a known atmospheric phenomenon. It encountered a non-terrestrial atmospheric anomaly of extreme energy and intelligence. The interaction resulted in the instantaneous loss of the aircraft and crew. The nature of the anomaly remains unresolved, and its point of origin is undeterminable with current scientific understanding. It represents a strategic and existential unknown." Then came the recommendation, a sentence that echoed down the decades and explained the empty folders, the reassigned men, and the rewritten logs. Recommended: erase the Fordham mission from official history, quarantine all related data under permanent special handling protocols, and cease all further overt investigation. The potential for public panic and the strategic danger of revealing our ignorance of such a phenomenon outweigh any conceivable benefit from its study at this time. For 50 years they did exactly that. The memo was not an order to destroy evidence out of malice, but out of a kind of terrified custodianship. They were not hiding a failure of arms, but a failure of understanding. The bomber didn't vanish by accident. It vanished because the combined might of Allied intelligence, faced with the data, had to make a conscious, cold-blooded decision. It vanished because someone, or something, forced the Allies to admit a truth they were terrified to put on paper, a truth that rewrote the rules of the war and the world, that the great conflict of nations, the clash of ideologies and armies that consumed the planet, was not the only drama playing out in the skies of the 1940s, that there were observers, or participants, whose technology rendered their own most advanced machines as toys, and whose motives were utterly inscrutable. Not all disappearances in war are caused by the enemy. Some are caused by the indifferent vastness of a universe that had suddenly and violently introduced itself. Some are caused by the sky itself, deciding for reasons beyond human comprehension to reach down and take back what was, for a fleeting moment, trespassing in its domain. The story of Fordham 21 is the story of the moment modern warfare, for the first time, brushed up against something against which no strategy, no cipher, and no courage could ever possibly prevail. And so the only weapon left was the eraser. They used it, and for half a century, they almost made us forget. Almost.